The email landed in my inbox at 3:47 p.m. on March 15th, my 50th birthday, with the subject line, "Happy Retirement." I stared at it like a tax bill addressed to someone else's house. Retirement? I wasn't retiring. I was Whitney Whitney Morrison, and I had more energy than a caffeine-addicted hummingbird and about as much intention of retiring as a shark has of becoming vegetarian. The message itself was a masterpiece of corporate cruelty wrapped in HR-approved ribbon. Thank you for your years of service. Your position has been eliminated as part of our organizational restructuring. Please clear your desk by end of business today. Best wishes for your golden years. Golden years. Like I was some dusty relic ready for the corporate scrap heap. I looked up from my computer to see Derek Whitmore, my new manager of exactly 6 weeks, hovering by my desk like a vulture in a polyester suit. His smile had all the warmth of a Morgue air conditioner, and his eyes held that particular gleam people get when they're watching someone else's house burn down. "So, Whitney," he said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy like honey from a broken jar, "I see you got the news. I know it's sudden, but we really need to streamline operations. Nothing personal. Nothing personal. Right. And tsunamis aren't personal to beaches." Derek had been brought in from outside, some hotshot from a consulting firm with an MBA fresher than morning bread and about half the substance. The owner, Mr. Patterson, had introduced him as fresh blood for fresh ideas, which in corporate speak translates to cheaper blood for expensive mistakes. Derek had spent his first week conducting efficiency assessments, which mostly involved him walking around with a clipboard, nodding seriously at things he clearly didn't understand, like a tourist pretending to appreciate abstract art. But I knew what this really was. Derek had figured out pretty quickly that while he might have the title, I had something far more valuable. I had the relationships. 23 years of building trust with suppliers across Asia, of learning not just their business practices but their cultural nuances, of remembering their children's names and their favorite holidays. While Derek was busy rearranging org charts, I was the one who knew that Mr. Kim in Seoul preferred his morning calls at exactly 9 a.m. local time, and that Mrs. Tanaka in Osaka would only discuss serious business after the proper tea ceremony courtesies. Derek wasn't stupid, he was calculating. He'd realized that as long as I was around, he'd always be the backup singer in his own show. So on my birthday, because timing is everything when you're twisting the knife, he'd convinced Patterson that I was redundant in our new operational framework. "I'll need your company phone and laptop," Derek continued, extending his hand like he was asking for spare change. "And your access cards, of course." I handed them over without a word, watching his relief bloom across his face like oil spreading on water. He thought he'd won. He thought he'd cleared the field. What Derek didn't realize was that he'd just handed me the keys to his professional destruction on a silver platter with a bow on top. "Oh, and Whitney," Derek added, his voice carrying that particular tone middle managers use when they think they're being clever, "I'll need you to send me all your supplier contact information and any notes about ongoing negotiations. You know, for continuity." I almost laughed. Derek wanted my Rolodex like a vampire wants an invitation into your house, thinking that having the address is the same as knowing the neighborhood. "Of course," I said, my voice sweeter than artificial honey. "I'll send you everything that's in the company database." Which was technically true. What I didn't mention was that the real relationships, the ones that mattered, lived in a realm Derek couldn't access with his administrative privileges. They lived in shared stories, mutual respect, and cultural understanding that took years to cultivate and couldn't be copied and pasted into a spreadsheet. As I walked toward the elevator, I caught sight of my reflection in the polished steel doors. 23 years of climbing corporate ladders, of proving myself in boardrooms full of men who thought I was there to take notes, of building something substantial from nothing. And Derek thought he could erase all of that with an email and a box. You see, Derek had made a classic corporate miscalculation. He'd confused the map with the territory. Sure, he had access to our vendor database, our contracts, our shipping schedules. But what he didn't have, what couldn't be downloaded or transferred or stolen, were the relationships I'd spent 2 decades building. The informal agreements. The personal trust. The cultural bridges that took years to construct and could be burned in a single poorly worded email. My journey into supply chain management hadn't started with grand ambitions. Fresh out of college with a business degree and student loans that followed me around like hungry puppies, I'd taken the first job offered, junior logistics coordinator at Patterson Industries. The company was smaller then, scrappier, and Mr. Patterson still walked the floors instead of hiding behind executive assistants. Back then, our Asian supplier network consisted of exactly 3 companies, all found through trade directories and managed through fax machines that sounded like robots having nervous breakdowns. My first assignment was to coordinate shipments, which in practice meant calling suppliers at ungodly hours and hoping someone spoke English. That's where I learned my first lesson in international business. Desperation is a universal language, but respect is currency. I remember my first call to Mr. Kim's father, the original Kim, who'd started the textile business in a sole basement with 2 sewing machines and unlimited determination. I'd prepared a script, practiced pronunciation, and still managed to sound like a lost tourist asking for directions to the bathroom. But instead of hanging up, the elder Kim had patiently corrected my pronunciation and taught me my first Korean business phrase, "Annyeonghaseyo, Kim Sajangnam, hello, President Kim." "You try to learn," he'd said in careful English. That is good beginning. From there, I'd thrown myself into cultural education like a starving person attacks a buffet. I took night classes in Mandarin, Korean, and Japanese. I read everything I could about Asian business customs, from the proper way to exchange business cards to the significance of gift-giving protocols. I learned that in China, never give someone a clock as a gift because it symbolizes death, and in Japan, the depth of your bow communicates respect more effectively than any words. But more than language and customs, I learned patience. While my American colleagues wanted immediate answers and next-day deliveries, I discovered that building trust in Asian business culture was like growing a garden. It required time, attention, and understanding that the best fruit comes to those who wait for the proper season. My breakthrough came during my 3rd year, when a shipping container full of textiles got lost somewhere between Busan and Long Beach. Not delayed, lost. Like the maritime equivalent of your luggage taking a vacation to Bermuda while you're standing in baggage claim in Detroit. Derek would have panicked, fired off angry emails, and probably threatened legal action. But I'd learned enough about Korean culture to know that shame is a powerful motivator, and that giving someone face-saving options often produces better results than public embarrassment. I called Mr. Kim, still the elder Kim then, and instead of demanding explanations, I asked for his guidance. "Kim Sajangnam," I said, "we have a situation that requires wisdom. How do you suggest we handle this together?" That word, together, changed everything. Within 6 hours, Kim had tracked down our container, arranged expedited shipping, and personally overseen quality control to ensure nothing had been damaged. What could have been a relationship-ending disaster became the foundation of a partnership that would last 2 decades. Word travels fast in Asian business circles, especially when it involves an American company that actually understands how to show respect. Within a year, I had requests from suppliers in Taiwan, Thailand, and Malaysia. By year 5, I was Patterson Industries' unofficial ambassador to Asia, traveling 4 times a year to maintain relationships that had become the backbone of our operations. I watched Derek's career trajectory during those early years. He was climbing corporate ladders at other companies, collecting titles like merit badges, always looking for the next rung up. Meanwhile, I was building something deeper, institutional knowledge that couldn't be headhunted away or replicated by competitors. I packed my personal items into a cardboard box that felt lighter than my spirits but heavier than Derek's understanding of international supply chain management. As I walked past his office, I could see him already on the phone, probably calling our suppliers to introduce himself as their new point of contact. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. That evening, I sat in my home office with a glass of wine that cost more than Derek's daily coffee budget and opened my personal laptop. Time to take inventory. Over the years, I'd cultivated relationships with 17 key suppliers across 6 countries. Not the kind of relationships that lived in company databases, but the kind that existed in shared meals, mutual respect, and cultural understanding. I'd learned enough Mandarin to navigate business dinners in Beijing, enough Japanese to understand the subtle art of nemawashi in Tokyo boardrooms, and enough Korean to appreciate the importance of nunchi in Seoul negotiations. But more importantly, I'd learned something Derek's MBA program had never taught him. In Asian business culture, relationships aren't just transactional, they're generational. When Mr. Kim's father had started their textile operation 50 years ago, he'd taught his son that trust was the only currency that never devalued. When Mrs. Tanaka had taken over her family's electronics component business, she'd inherited not just factories but a philosophy that partnerships were marriages, not hookups. These weren't just vendors to me, they were colleagues, sometimes friends, always respected partners. And tomorrow, Derek was going to try to manage these relationships like he was ordering pizza. I started making a list. Not of what I'd lost, but of what I still had. My phone, my personal phone, contained contact information that wasn't in any company directory. Email addresses that ended in gmail.com and yahoo.com instead of corporate domains. WeChat IDs and WhatsApp numbers. Direct lines that bypassed switchboards and secretaries. But I wasn't going to call them. Not yet. That would be too obvious, too desperate. Instead, I was going to wait. I was going to let Derek hang himself with the rope of his own incompetence. The first sign of trouble came 3 days later. My former colleague Janet, still trapped in Derek's new organizational structure, texted me from her personal phone. "Whitney, the Seoul shipment is delayed. Derek sent some interesting emails. Mr. Kim is asking for you specifically." I smiled into my morning coffee. Derek had probably opened with something like, "As the new supply chain director, I'm implementing new efficiency protocols," which in Korean business culture was roughly equivalent to walking into someone's house and rearranging their furniture without being invited. The screenshots Janet sent me later that day were pure comedy gold. Derek's first email to Mr. Kim started with, "To whom it may concern," and proceeded to explain how the company was optimizing vendor relationships for maximum ROI. He'd addressed Kim as Mr. Korea Textiles instead of using his proper name, suggested switching to monthly payment terms instead of the weekly payments we'd honored for 15 years, and concluded with a demand for a 15% price reduction to align with market standards. In Korean business culture, Derek had just committed the equivalent of showing up to a wedding in a bathing suit while insulting the bride's mother. Mr. Kim's response was politely devastating. "We appreciate your communication. We will review our business relationship with careful consideration." In American corporate speak, that was a diplomatic way of saying, "Go step on a Lego, you culturally clueless walrus." But Derek, armed with the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong because he'd never been tested, interpreted Kim's politeness as compliance. He forwarded the email to Patterson with a note, already seeing positive response from vendor optimization. "Kim seems very cooperative." I could practically hear the Titanic violins playing in the distance. Janet kept me updated on the unfolding disaster with regular texts that read like a car crash in slow motion. Derek had managed to confuse Mrs. Tanaka by addressing all his emails to Mr. Tanaka, despite her clear signature indicating she was the company president. He'd scheduled calls during Golden Week, Japan's biggest holiday, and then sent follow-up emails questioning their commitment to the partnership when no one answered. But the crown jewel of Derek's cultural incompetence came when he tried to negotiate with our Taiwanese supplier, Chen Electronics. Derek had read somewhere that Chinese businesspeople appreciate directness, so he'd opened the call by saying, "Let's cut through the small talk and get down to business." What Derek didn't realize was that Mr. Chen was old-school Taiwanese, and in his culture, relationship building isn't small talk, it's the entire foundation of business. You don't skip the courtesies any more than you skip the foundation when building a house. Chen's response was swift and final. "We regret to inform you that Chen Electronics will be unable to continue our partnership beyond current contract obligations." 23 years of careful relationship building, and Derek had managed to destroy one of our most reliable suppliers in a single phone call. It was like watching someone use a Stradivarius violin as a baseball bat. By the end of the week, I had a complete picture. Derek had managed to insult 3 suppliers, confuse 2 shipping schedules, and completely misunderstand a cultural holiday that had delayed production by a week. The dominoes were falling faster than his credibility. That's when my phone started ringing. "Whitney-san," came Mrs. Tanaka's familiar voice, "we are having some communication difficulties with your former company. The new person does not seem to understand our way of working." "I'm so sorry to hear that, Tanaka-san," I replied, slipping back into the formal courtesy that Derek would never master. "Unfortunately, I'm no longer with the company." "Ah," she said, and I could hear the understanding in that single syllable. "Perhaps we should discuss alternative arrangements." And there it was. The first crack in Derek's foundation. Over the next 2 weeks, I fielded similar calls from suppliers across Asia. Each conversation was courteous, professional, and devastatingly effective. I wasn't badmouthing my former company, I didn't need to. Derek was doing that all by himself with every email he sent and every call he made. Meanwhile, I was quietly setting up shop. Whitney Morrison Logistics Consulting had a nice ring to it, don't you think? I rented a small office space, got business cards printed, and started drafting proposals for something Derek had never considered: direct consulting relationships with the suppliers themselves. You see, while Derek was trying to manage suppliers, I was going to help suppliers manage their American clients. Instead of being the middleman, I was going to be the translator, not just of language, but of culture, expectations, and business practices. If you're sitting there thinking, "Yep, I've been in Whitney's shoes," it would mean the world if you smashed that subscribe button. Every click helps me launch another Derek into the unemployment stratosphere where he belongs. The beautiful thing about Derek's incompetence was its consistency. By week 3, 2 major shipments had been delayed, one supplier had refused to honor a discount they'd given us for 15 years, and another had quietly started prioritizing other clients' orders over ours. Patterson was starting to ask questions, and Derek was starting to sweat like a snowman in Miami. That's when I made my move. I called Mr. Kim first. Not to gloat, not to complain, but to offer a solution. "Kim SSI, I said, using the respectful honorific he appreciated, "I understand you've been having difficulties with my former company." "Whitney." His voice brightened immediately. "Yes, this Derek person, he is very different from you." "I imagine he is. I wanted to let you know that I've started my own consulting practice. I help Asian suppliers navigate American business culture and manage their client relationships more effectively." There was a pause, and then, "This is very interesting. Can we discuss this further?" Within 2 days, I had signed Kim Textiles as my first client. Within a week, I had 3 more. And here's the beautiful part: I wasn't stealing business from my former company. I was helping their suppliers become better suppliers. Which meant that when those suppliers eventually decided they didn't want to work with Derek anymore, they'd already have alternatives lined up. By month 2, the dam broke completely. Patterson called me personally. "Whitney, I'm wondering if you'd consider coming back. We seem to be having some transition difficulties." "I appreciate the call, Mr. Patterson," I said, my voice as smooth as aged whiskey, "but I'm quite happy with my new venture." "What would it take?" he asked, desperation creeping into his voice like water into a sinking ship. "I'm afraid that ship has sailed," I replied. "But I'd be happy to discuss a consulting arrangement." The meeting was scheduled for the following week. When I walked into that conference room, the same conference room where Derek had probably celebrated my departure, I wasn't the same person who'd packed her desk in a cardboard box. I was Whitney Morrison, CEO of Whitney Morrison Logistics Consulting, wearing a suit that cost more than Derek's monthly salary and carrying a briefcase full of solutions to problems he'd created. Derek was there, of course, looking like a deer in headlights if the deer had an MBA and a severe case of imposter syndrome. Patterson was there too, along with the CFO and the head of operations. They looked like a board of directors trying to figure out how their ship had started sinking so quickly. "Gentlemen," I began, setting my briefcase on the table with the confidence of someone who holds all the cards, "I understand you've been having some supply chain challenges." What followed was the most satisfying 45 minutes of my professional career. I laid out, point by point, exactly what had gone wrong and why. Not with malice, not with anger, but with the cold, clinical precision of a surgeon describing a failed operation. "Your suppliers aren't just vendors," I explained, my voice never rising above conversational level. "They're partners who've been treated like vending machines. Mr. Kim hasn't returned your calls not because he's unprofessional, but because Derek's first email to him was essentially a demand disguised as an introduction. Mrs. Tanaka isn't delaying shipments out of spite, she's protecting her other clients from the chaos that's currently consuming your supply chain." Derek tried to interrupt twice. Both times, I silenced him with nothing more than a raised hand and a look that could freeze hell. "The solution," I continued, "isn't to find new suppliers. It's to rebuild the relationships you've damaged." Which brings me to my proposal. I slid a folder across the table. Inside was a comprehensive consulting agreement that would essentially put me in charge of rebuilding everything Derek had destroyed, at a rate that was triple my former salary. "This is the cost of fixing what's been broken," I said simply. "Take it or leave it." Patterson didn't even hesitate. "When can you start?" "I can start immediately," I replied, "but I'll need complete authority over supplier relationships. No interference, no second-guessing, no collaborative management with anyone who doesn't understand the difference between Seoul and Beijing." Derek's face went through more color changes than a mood ring in a washing machine. But I'm the supply chain director, he stammered. I turned to him with a smile that had all the warmth of a tax audit. Derek, you were the supply chain director. Now you're the supply chain disaster. There's a difference. Patterson cleared his throat. Derek, I think it might be best if you transition to other opportunities. And just like that, Derek was gone. Not fired on his birthday, he wasn't important enough for that level of poetic justice, just quietly shuffled out like yesterday's newspaper. 6 months later, I had rebuilt every relationship Derek had damaged and strengthened several he'd never even known existed. My consulting firm had grown to include 5 other specialists, each with their own network of international connections. We'd become the go-to firm for companies who wanted to do business in Asia without stepping on cultural landmines. Patterson offered to buy my company outright for more money than I'd made in my entire career at his firm. I politely declined. Some things aren't for sale, and my freedom was one of them. As for Derek? Last I heard, he'd found a position managing supply chains for a company that sold pool supplies in Minnesota. No international vendors, no cultural nuances, no relationships to destroy. Just chlorine and pool noodles. It suited him perfectly. The real victory wasn't watching Derek fall, though I won't lie, that was satisfying. The real victory was building something better from the ashes of what he'd tried to destroy. My suppliers became partners, my partners became friends, and my friends became the foundation of something bigger than any corporate ladder Derek could have imagined. They thought they were firing dead weight on my 50th birthday. Instead, they cut me loose to become their biggest competitor. Thanks for sticking with this story, you workplace warriors. If you enjoyed watching Derek get his comeuppance, that subscribe button is calling your name. Unless you're currently pulling a Derek somewhere, in which case, maybe it's time to update that resume. Remember, in the game of corporate chess, the queen is always the most powerful piece on the board. And sometimes, the best revenge is simply refusing to play by someone else's rules.